Hi, good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining in this session today, which is going to be the last one for covering the Learning Outcome 4 for Research project. So today it's going to be a short session, keeping in mind there is only one assessment criteria that we need to look at for this particular learning outcome. Now, if I look at doing a quick bit of recap in terms of what we've discussed so far in this particular unit, what we are looking at is um, here the idea of studying this particular unit is to try and develop skills and techniques to be able to understand how research is done. And specifically, research being such a vast field, what we are looking at doing is developing an understanding into doing or carrying out a series of activities, investigation, for the purposes of research to uncover, find maybe cures, for example, new diagnosis, or in some cases, discovery of new diseases and obviously new medication, new treatments, and things like that from a context of health and social care. Now, research can be done in very many different contexts. Research can be primary, secondary, and it can be tertiary. Now, sometimes research is done to look at enabling decision making. Senior management wants to look at going through data reports and obviously then looks at making decisions on the basis of those past data and reports, which give you prediction in terms of how the business is going, or in some cases, how, say, for example, if we look at A&E wait times, which is the target defined by CQC, and the NHS England is 2 hours, but currently wait times in certain areas with the service is in excess of 6 hours. Now, in order for them to get it down to a manageable 2 hour time frame, a number of factors are responsible, in order to looking at decreasing that time frame, which is required to hit that target of 2 hours set by CQC. So in those cases, if somebody is to look at investigating why the time from the time the ambulance picks up a patient from the home to the time it's takes the patient to the hospital and then does a handover to the local team or the medics in the hospital. Why does it take that handover takes 4 hours, 6 hours, or whatever that time frame is? Now, if somebody has to investigate, they have to get into researching all the aspects of the operations which are involved from the time the call 999 call originates to the time the ambulance picks up the patient and the time the ambulance actually discharges the patient or hands over the discharge of that patient to the hospital or these medics and staff at the hospital. Now, this would require you to undertake a systematic investigation to understand all the parameters which are involved in this process. And this would constitute, say, for example, undertaking a research project. Now, the reason why it is a research, because you're looking at understanding the factors which are leading to these delays. And this is what is required to be studied in this particular unit. Now, and as a case in point, as an example, we would be looking to do a practical project. And this project, from my understanding and my recommendation point of view, or a suggestion point of view, I'll put it this way, would be to look at doing a secondary or a desk-based research, wherein you're not looking at going out to collect data from participants or primary research. This is to look at understanding the process, but also at the same time looking at making good use of time, because what you want to be able to do is develop skills and understand the techniques which are required to carry on some of these activities which are done under the name of research, in order to uncover, for example, problems, issues, gaps, or areas which are going to be problematic or are posing problems. And then you are looking at carrying out these series of activities to try and identify the issues and then look at recommending solutions which are going to help you overcome some of these problem or gap areas. Now, this particular unit we've discussed, we've had 3 sessions so far. We've discussed the 3 different learning outcomes. As you can see, the unit specification on your screen. What we want to be able to do is understand the first learning outcome was purely theoretical. It was to understand how to formulate a research specification. So here there's a template that I've shared with you, which is going to be a research proposal, and that would help you understand how do we go about putting together the shell of carrying out a research project. Now, that would include things like introduction, background to the research, aims and objective, rationale. It'll also have, to a certain extent, hypothesis and selection of if you want to test a particular hypothesis or a situation. And then you would also look at some of the key resources which are required to be able to carry out that project, which could be resources in terms of manpower, administrative, operational, financial resources, and a sponsor which will be looking at sponsoring the undertaking of that particular project. Now, here we also look at some of the elements, broader elements of how a research report is put together, and they would be looking into things like introduction, literature review. We look at research methodology. We look at a conceptual framework. We'll also look at creating a timeline or a Gantt chart, which will give us that how long will the project work, what will be the various phases, and how long will you work on some of these phases of the project to then ultimately collate the data, present the findings, draw some conclusions, and then publish the research report. Now, in the second learning outcome, it was second, third, and fourth are mostly practical because it says be able to. So here we are looking at implementing the research project with agreed procedures which have been defined in the research specification or the proposal that we put together in the start. And this is where we are looking at, we went into details of understanding how do we look at hypothesis testing. So we looked at null hypothesis, we looked at chi-square hypothesis, which are generally used. And then we also looked at how do you look at collating data in terms of research methodology. The focus was on research onion, wherein we went into understanding various phases from looking at research, say for example, philosophy, went into the research approach. We looked at the strategy in terms of research. What strategy would be drawn up to carry out that research activities? Then we looked at a time horizon, which is timeline, and then finally data collection and analysis, along with the presentation of summary. Now, in the third learning outcome, we looked at how do we look at evaluating research outcomes. So research outcomes tend to be, the results or the conclusions that you're going to, and how would these be related to your original project specification or the proposal which was drawn up, and then the triangulation of evidence which is done to conclude the findings of your research, which is taking into account the review of the literature that you've carried out, the aims and objectives which were initially set, and the data which you've collated, and the findings from that data are then triangulated and presented and related to the review of the literature and your aims and objectives, and appropriate conclusions are drawn. Now, sometimes research, you start off doing or carrying out research to find out, you want to be looking at some results, but sometimes they are not possible to be achieved because of considerations, or let's put it this way, because of constraints which come across when you're carrying out that research, and that those constraints could be ethical considerations, it could be resources constraint, it could be time constraints, and they have to be taken into account to ensure that when future areas of research is done, you also then make recommendations to say that if this study is to be extended further and picked up for further research, these could be the areas which need to be analyzed, because while you were carrying out that research, there were these limitations which were faced, and as long as these limitations are overcome, this will allow you to progress the research into the area which has been which is what got say left out or did not get covered. Now, in today's learning outcome, we are going to be looking at how to present the research outcomes. So here it is more of a formal presentation that you need to do when you look at how research conclusions and the findings of the research have to be compiled into a report and then presented to an appropriate audience, let's put it this way, to an audience with an appropriate format for that report. So this particular learning outcome is just going to be focused on how do you essentially present sorry, if I say compile and then present the findings of your report to your audience, and that is what is going to be covered primarily in today's discussion. So I'll switch over to the presentation slides, and here is where we want to briefly look at discussing this in terms of how the findings of the research are generally presented to a specified audience. Now, what we want to look at primarily before I go into is to, as I've just generally refreshed, I want to go into understanding, what are the areas through which, or what are the what is the broad structure of how you present your report. Now, when research results are to be presented, they are generally done, the presentation of the results can generally be done in 3 different formats. One tends to be an oral presentation. That means you publish a report, you have an abstract, you have an introduction, you have the 5 chapters of your research. But apart from that, you also make an oral presentation of your research to basically present it to an audience. A lot of us have seen the news, and a lot of times you see these press briefings which generally happen. I'm just talking on a very macro scale. These press briefings which generally happen. Say, for example, the last press briefing that I saw was NASA trying to land an aircraft on an asteroid. Now, obviously, this was a project managed by a group of engineers, NASA engineers, and obviously the successful impact and landing of crashing that particular object into an asteroid, was a project which was successfully implemented. So this press briefing, which generally happened in front of a few journalists, basically goes about presenting the series, the sequence, not the series, the sequence of events which took place in order to make this particular, let's say, the target possible. And that was landing or crashing a spacecraft into an asteroid to see the impact of how it can change the, say, trajectory of the asteroid, by the impact of crashing the aircraft on it. Now, this was an oral presentation. A press briefing generally would be an oral presentation. If I was doing a project, a research project, and I'd compiled a report of 10 to 12,000 words, and I was a university student, this would have been an oral presentation as a viva voce, which would have been done in front of my lecturers or my supervisor who has helped me supervise the project, and that could be an oral presentation I do. An oral presentation could be also done generally that we get to see in offices when you carry out we carry out lots of micro projects or small projects in our place of work, and these projects, when your boss or your supervisor tells you to present the findings to the team, you normally would call everybody to a meeting room and you will present the findings. Okay, this is what I did, this is what the task, and this is how I went about it, and these are the findings. And when you share that, you're basically looking at making an oral presentation. Sometimes you're also looking at making poster presentations, which is to basically visually, graphically, or statistically put across data on a poster and obviously make that presentation. And generally, all research and research reports are published as written papers. Now, if it is a report which is published, from a scientific point of view, if it's a credible report, or it could be published in articles in journals and various medical journals, or various sector-related journals, and that is where these reports could be peer-reviewed. It could be looked at by other researchers, and obviously they could also comment on them. So generally, research is published, as a research report as well. Now, when you look at publishing the results of your research or the outcomes of your research, we normally structure the report into 5 different chapters, and these tend to be: chapter 1 normally includes introduction to the research, the aims and objectives, the rationale, the background, and why you're looking at carrying out the research. It also details out things like hypothesis testing, and to a certain extent, if it's a detailed research, then it will also highlight what is called the research conceptual framework. Then chapter 2 tends to be the review of your literature, and this review of the literature tends to be looking at the existing pieces of data which are currently available, and this existing piece of data which is currently available is looked at to extract meaningful information out for the areas of research that you're going to carry out. And now, this will also include conceptual framework, so that you are going to try and create some let's say a relationship or connections between, say, different types of parameters, which will be useful for you to conclude and keep the research narrow, and then help in successfully coming out with findings for the research. An example that I had given earlier in one of the reports which I'd shown in the learning outcomes was that if you were looking at establishing the consumer purchase decisions, which are based on brand equity of Samsung, which I think took an example of in one of the sessions, then you're looking at drawing up a conceptual framework in terms of understanding what are the various brand elements and how do these elements essentially influence the consumer purchase decision, and that would help you understand in which direction you need to take this research. And those elements of brand identity, the when I say the elements of the brand identity for, say, a specific thing, which is like a product like like a mobile phone, which I'd given an example of, things like style, shape, form. You're looking at visual elements, color, logo, watermark. They would then be used to construct a conceptual framework, and you will go about doing research to try and find data related to these elements of brand identity and then relate them to consumer purchase decision. And that would be a conceptual framework that you will create. So for all research projects, generally, we look at creating a conceptual framework which is a combination of an independent variable, dependent variable, and some of your aims and objectives, which primarily would help in undertaking those activities to find the areas that you want to uncover while taking on that research. Chapter 3 tends to be research methodology, wherein you go about defining what is the strategy, philosophy, the approach that you're going to take to go about for collecting data, including participants, and then obviously gathering that data to look at doing some analysis. Chapter 4 is going to be presentation of your collection of findings and analysis in terms of looking at statistical software like Qualmetrics, SPSS. You might look at doing some sort of analysis using regression or ANOVA. And the idea is, if you have large sample size or you have large number of participants from which you've gathered this data, you would need softwares to be able to crunch it down to meaningful tables, graphs, and essentially visual elements that would be used to present the data for people who would be able to understand what the research has uncovered, and they would then be presented as findings. The last chapter tends to be conclusion or recommendations, and this is where you kind of bring everything together to conclude, to say that these were the areas of my research, this is what I've uncovered, these are the findings, and these are the conclusions of the research project. And then you also make recommendations for the future areas of research, and also briefly detail out some of the ethical considerations which were taken into account while conducting the research, and if there were any constraints which have not allowed you to complete or carry out the project in terms of research as an activity as a whole, then you would mention those constraints as well, so that if there are any future areas of research which somebody takes up or they look at expanding into that research report, then they know what could be the limitations and constraints they face, so that they can be overcome easily before they start to take that further. So this is what the whole crux of presentation of the research outcome will tend to be. Now, if I just briefly put a few slides together, to explain some of these individual chapters. When we look at introduction, as I mentioned, it gives you the background information on why and what is being investigated. It also looks at describing the current state of affairs in terms of what is currently present in the public domain, and you would look at collating that information so that you are clear that this is what is already there. We need to go in beyond, do the activities beyond the available data to be able to research or go into a bit more depth, and that would generally tend to be the part related to introduction of the project. Then you have literature review, which basically looks at summarizing, organizing the relevant data which is present around the area of your research, where it could be collated from books, articles, published research on the on the internet, and this could be then helping you set up both either a qualitative or a quantitative study approach, which is required to undertake the research for the aims and objectives or the questions that you put in for the purposes of your research. So literature review tends to be a review of existing data which is available, and that data is closely related to your area of research, and that is why we look at doing that review, so that you exactly know that this is already there, this has already been researched, this information is already available. We need to go up and beyond this, and that is where you will look at defining what could be the areas in which you would get into more detailing to be able to uncover by taking on those activities of investigation and research. Methodology would be describing the process in terms of how you would go about carrying that research. And this tends to be in sufficient detail because we refer to the research onion, and that would essentially mean that you're taking into account things like, your research philosophy, your approach, your strategy, and then obviously how long you're going to carry that research out, what resources would be required, as I mentioned earlier, financial equipment, administrative, operational resources, manpower resources, and then how you would go about collating that data and then present it. If it's quantitative research, looking at quantitative techniques, which is data being numerical, and qualitative means you're looking at more of thematic understanding, or looking at emerging trends that will be presented in order to look at drawing conclusions from the report. The chapter 4 is finding and results, and obviously that is required because you at some stage would tabulate whatever has been uncovered in terms of collation of data, from collection of data which has been done. You will collate it, analyze it, and at some stage you will present that into some sort of some sort of a chapter in the report, and that tends to be the finding and results chapter. Here you're going to be looking at summarizing the data which has been collected, the inferences from the data which has been collected and compiled, and that would be the part of presenting it in a format which is easily understood by your audience. So I will be looking at drawing up graphs, maybe some sort of tables which I will present. I'll be looking at doing my hypothesis testing. I will also be looking at relating some of the findings that I've got to the conceptual framework to try and see if it meets the requirement of what I started with when I started to carry out these research activities. And towards the end, what we'll also look at is present these findings and triangulate it so that they are related to the review of literature that I've carried out. They relate to my aims and objectives, and I've not dissuaded from what I actually started to put out as a topic. And then later on, I have uncovered that this is something which I've got results which are not totally related to the aims and objectives and the reasons of the rationale of the study that I started out with. So the idea is to try and relate them to the review of literature and the aims and objectives and the hypothesis test, proposed hypothesis that you have done at the start of your research. One of the other key things that I would also mention that sometimes people have to do, and it is a good practice to do, is you also put an acknowledgement down to say, these have been the contributors of, you would like to thank people who have contributed successfully towards your research activity and your project. And they could be your supervisors, your mentors, your participants, and in some cases, your colleagues or people who have helped you actually run that research and come out with this particular report. Now, the only assessment criteria in this particular learning outcome is to talk about an agreed format or a media through which you'll be able to present the outcomes of your research. So here, generally, when we have drawn up the research specification in the first learning outcome, what we also do is we basically put a bit of a summary to say that in chapter 5, I'm going to be presenting the research findings of will be presenting my research findings, and these research findings will be published as a report, and they will have this particular structure. Now, when you publish a report, you also accompany that along with a PowerPoint presentation, sometimes a couple of slides, which is just to summarize the main points, because sometimes the published research report runs into hundreds of pages. So what you want to be able to do is draw up a bit of a summary on a PowerPoint or a Prezi to make sure that if you have to give a very concise presentation of that to a selected audience, then that could be used as a report, as an outlet to present that report to your audience. And that is something which is what you will organize in the 5 chapters, like I've done in the PowerPoint slide. So we start with introduction, literature review, research methodology. This is obviously a generic sense that I'm presenting, but at some stage you would be looking at, presenting the findings of your research under these 5 broad headings. and they would be an agreed format in which how you would go about presenting the findings of your research. And that would be the research report. And this will then present, the report will essentially highlight and present what are the research outcomes. Now, essentially speaking, there are lots of feedback and questionnaires which are also taken into account once the research has been done. You do, as I mentioned, acknowledge the support of some of the other colleagues which have contributed significantly, or in howsoever small or form, shape or form, but you do acknowledge their contributions to the research, and that basically helps summarize a kind of a research report, which is then presented in an appropriate format as per as per what has been agreed in the research proposal or the specifications which was initially drawn up at the start. Now, what I want to also look at is briefly, maybe very briefly, show you an example of say a research report, and this might not be directly related to, say, for example, let's put it this way, to the health and social care context in particular. But what I want to do is show you a detailed report which will essentially help you understand that at some stage when a research project is carried out and it is then presented, it is done in a way and format which basically looks at covering all the points that we have discussed, say, for example, from a point of view of covering this particular unit. So let me share a particular report, which is a research project which has been carried out, and this is related to, say, understanding that the overarching title of the research report is Effectiveness of Advertisement on Small Enterprises in the South Asian country like Pakistan. So a case study of MPL, which is a mobile phone firm in a city called Karachi. Now, the table of contents that you look at in terms of the index which has been drawn up, TOCs, as I would put it this way, as you can see, is presenting the report in 5 broad chapters. Chapter 1, Introduction; Chapter 2, Literature Review; and then we go into research methodology, which is Chapter 3. Chapter 4 looks at data analysis, finding, and then Chapter 5 basically looks at drawing conclusions and recommendations for the report. Now, this is a fairly small research project, which is what you are also going to be looking at doing in the context of health and social care. About 4,500 words, as I mentioned to you. And as you can see, this particular report is broken down nicely into 5 chapters. So the title of the research project is Effectiveness of Advertising on Small in Small Enterprises. And as you would see, the learner has started off with an introduction of chapter, which is in Chapter 1. And then the learner has tried to develop a bit of give us a bit of a background and try to develop a rationale of why the research is being done. So he's looked at definitions of things like small enterprises, the importance of small enterprises, SMEs as companies, what is advertising, rationale of study, that how much spend is good for these companies to do in order to attract consumers, and then the creation of objectives, 1 or 2 brief objectives. So how does, say, for example, a company like MPL promote itself in the market? Do smaller organizations think advertising is effective? So these are the 2 objectives that the learner has taken. There could be a limitation which the learner has already looked at, which could be in the process when he carries out the research. So he's put those limitations down, and that basically gives us, the first part of the report. The second part of the report looks into existing review of data, which is present in terms of books, articles, journals, existing research reports. They will pick up data. They will provide data on advertising. What is the approach SMEs take on advertising? Is there a rationale for them to advertise? What kind of outlets of advertising they look into in terms of channels? And then does the audience in Pakistan, in a particular city like Karachi, look into, responding to those advertising campaigns which the companies run, and does it have an effective outcome for the companies to be able to increase business or reach out to consumers. So some bit of review has been done by looking at some of the broad parameters which are concerned directly with the research of this particular report, and that has been presented in the literature review. And the methodology, the learner has gone about describing the approach that he's going to take. He's going to be looking at studying the existing theories, existing data which has been collected on reports, and then follow quantitative methods to basically look at taking that approach to basically go about investigating to find out more detail whether advertising is effective for SMEs in Pakistan or not. And then that has been detailed out into a strategy, which is you'll be using questionnaires. They'll be going into primary data collection. Sample size has been defined that he's going to look at a target size of 50 companies from employees or staff within those companies are going to be sent questionnaires to be asked. How will the data be collected? Is it going to be done through electronic route, through the postal route? But because he's looking at primary data collection, he's looking at obviously sending out questionnaires, and then how the analysis of data would be done. So he's looking at designing a questionnaire which is going to be based on Likert scale, wherein Likert scale tends to be, you give multiple choice questions, but you give a scale which basically says strongly agree, neutral, disagree, and strongly disagree. And there is a marking scheme behind this in terms of the questions that are designed, and that will allow the learner to tabulate results and get meaningful data for analysis once the questionnaires are received back. Any ethical considerations have been defined, any hypothesis that he's looked at, he's looking at using the chi-square test hypothesis, and he's formulated one, and that is going to be used to basically do his research. And then he's also defined a timeline, as I mentioned, using a Gantt chart, and that is chapter 3. Chapter 4 is presentation of data and the findings which have come out from the collation of questionnaires that he's collected from 50 participants, and they've been presented nicely using graphs, as you can see. So has he gone across to the demographics, employees, type of employees, male, female, frequency, in terms of which companies he's gone to, the age group of the employees, the age of the organization in terms of how many years they've been running. Then he's looked at, obviously the questionnaires using the Likert scale. He's drawn up some details which have been directly coming from questions like companies, do they advertise, don't advertise, do they believe advertising works? And those have been then presented as tables, as you can see, in the findings side of the report. And this visually provides, you data essentially to say and to arrive at conclusions in terms of, whether the advertising is as a route, as a medium, is effective for small, medium enterprises to, attract more consumers towards their business. And he's tested the hypothesis, as you can see, by doing the analysis of the data collated from the questionnaires, and then presented that as tables. And then towards the end, what I will do is basically he has then gone about presenting the findings and conclusions that he's drawn from the report. And then last but not the least, a detailed list of references, books, articles, journals, resources essentially that have been used to gather data, collate that data, have been mentioned in the bibliography. Now, in the annexure, he's also published the questionnaire which has been designed by him to capture data from participants. So as you can see, he's drawn up a small questionnaire of 9 questions. It talks about some basic information about the organization, and then 5 questions which primarily would be asked, which have been asked, in which the participants are going to put comments down whether they agree, strongly agree, disagree, neutral, or absolutely disagree that advertising helps small businesses or their own business to increase their revenue or increase their customer base. And basis the findings of this questionnaire, he is then compiled a report which has been presented as a published Word document. So this is an example of a research project which I wanted to share. And there are plenty of examples available on the internet, and then the report which I have asked you to look at, the two websites, the Health Foundation and also the NHS website, which will allow you essentially to, let's say, download a particular report and then use that report to be able to, let's put it this way, compile a Word document like this, which will be a secondary desk-based research report. That would essentially be is something which I would suggest that you need to do as a part of this particular assignment. So we will catch up, and obviously I will send across a copy of this report or a report related to the health and social care sector, so that you can look at that report as a sampler and then go about carrying a research topic, choose a topic, and then go about carrying a desk-based research and then compile a report to be able to achieve this particular unit. Now, any questions at this stage, I'll be more than happy to take, and the idea would be to try and discuss them via email or essentially through an assignment discussion session. And there are details available up on Moodle, which I want to show you just before we end, so that you can actually go in and also look at some of the details, for this particular, let's say, when you look at studying this unit in a bit more detail. So let me just switch you over to the Moodle. Now, when you go into Moodle, what you're going to see is when you click on the research project unit, and that will expand. And what I've done is all the presentations have been put up here, which have been made. And these presentations would essentially be the discussions that we have done, over the course of discussion for this particular unit. And they, along with that, I have also included, certain books and handouts. And these books and handouts essentially are important because they will help you understand, and crystallize some of the topics for the purposes of increasing your knowledge in terms of how to go about carrying the research. Now, there are some books that I've uploaded. Obviously, there are different types which have been recommended and suggested by the awarding body. There is one particular handout which talks about research methodology and techniques, although it's a detailed handout, but I would suggest that, this is the research onion part of it, which I'd shared if you want to look at. And this bit is primarily going to be, a summary. So if I put it this way here, this part, which is the research onion, is a summary of that particular, book here. Then there is another book, which is Research Methodology, a step-by-step guide. I would suggest that this is, again, a detailed academic book, which you can look into. But there are obviously bits and pieces that we have covered. But if you want to go into details in terms of any particular chapter, like understanding what is literature review, what is research methodology, how to formulate a research project specification, and then presenting findings, then this would be the book that you would need to look at for going into a bit more detail. There are specific abstracts that I've taken out, from various books. And these are useful because research methodology, for example, if you want to look at studying this in a bit more detail, is going to just focus on this chapter, which is chapter 3. And this will be a good handout for you to read. And then if you want to look at the overall basics of how to carry out research and the unit in general, this is a very good, concise book, which is talking about the basics of how do we carry out research and how do you present the findings of your research as a report. And it's a good read, but again, a detailed, book, which essentially would mean that you're looking at spending, about 10 to 15 hours to go through this in a bit more detail. So some part of these, some of the presentations that I've made, have been done, and I've referred to these books to include data, relevant data, which is meeting the specifications of the unit and covers the indicative content in detail. And they have been done and have been compiled by by gleaning into some of the data from these books and the extracts of the books that I've made available. So if you have any questions, feel free to get back to me on email. And what I will do is ensure that I'll come back to you with the relevant data and an example of a research report in the health and social care sector, which I'm going to upload here later today, and that could be also accessible from the unit when you're reading and going through it. So at this stage, if you have any questions, feel free to ask me now. Otherwise, I'm going to try and end this session, and I will catch up with you next week. Okay, not a problem. And see you next week, and we will look at doing our discussion on this particular unit for the purposes of assignment.